Ha ha ha. Okay. This is the reading and shadowing practice. And today, previous video, I read this written by Edward Said, the representations of the intellectual. I read, and today also I'll keep reading and continue the last point. Continue from the last point. So little bit changing. Okay. So uh, okay. Mhm. Okay. So let's read from this point. Okay. From this point. At the other extreme, there is Julian Bender's celebrated definition of intellectuals as at the other extreme. There is Julian Bender's celebrated definition, celebrated okay, no. Mm, okay. This D punished and celebrated definition of intellectuals as a tiny wait, no, as a teeny band of band of super gifted and morally endowed philosopher. And where is the end point? Okay, this is the end point. Come on. Band of super gifted and morally endowed philosopher kings who constitute the conscience the conscience, conscience of mankind. While it is true that Bender's treatise La Trahison des Crux, the maybe French, I can't pronounce, the betrayal of love. The intellectuals had lived in austerity, more as I'm not good at lighting R. But this R. Okay. More as a blistering attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles than as a systematic analysis of intellectual life. He does in fact cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considered to be real intellectuals. Okay. No. So let's hear his voice.
Every intellectual today, 1927, setters for the presence of is thus what it means is born into a language, for obvious reasons of convenience and familiarity, but also because he or she hopes to impress on the language a particular sound, a special accent, and finally a perspective that is one's own. The particular problem of the intellectual, however, is that there already exists a language community in each society that is dominated by habits of expression, one of whose main functions is to keep things going smoothly, unchanged, unchallenged. George Orwell talks about this very persuasive perspective that is one French
nations and position at bay.
Are each of them set in a very particular historical development with its own problems, triumphs, and peculiarities. To some extent, this narrowing focus and localization in the way we look at intellectuals is also due to the fantastic proliferation of specialized studies, which have quite justifiably tracked the expanding role of intellectuals in modern life. Yet despite all this difference and otherness, despite the inevitable erosion in the universal concept of what it means to be an intellectual, some general notions about the individual intellectual, which is my concern here, do seem to have more than strictly local application. The first of these that I want to discuss is nationality, and with it, that hothouse development out of nationality, nationalism. Every individual intellectual is born into a language, and for the most part spends the rest of his or her life in that language, which is the principal medium of intellectual activity.
Mm-hmm.
Languages, of course, are always national.
Nation, representations of I was let the
What I care about as an intellectual policy
first part.
consent of potential customers, win approval, marshal consumer or voter opinion. Gramsci believed that these organic intellectuals were actively involved in society. That is, they constantly struggled to change minds and expand markets. Unlike teachers and priests who seem more or less to remain in place, doing the same kind of work year in and year out, organic intellectuals are always on the move, on the make. At the other
Okay, I found intellectual always on the make.
year out, organic
Year in,
intellectuals
year
are
out.
always on the move, on the make.
Okay, let's listen.
At the other extreme, there's Julien Benda, an early 20th century French man of letters.
At the other extreme,
His celebrated definition of intellectuals is that they are a tiny band of super gifted and morally endowed philosopher kings
gifted and morally endowed,
who constitute the conscience of mankind. While it's true that Benda's treatise, La
or it's true.
Trahison des Clercs, the betrayal of the intellectuals, has lived in posterity more as a blistering attack on intellectuals who abandon
More as
their calling and compromise their principles, rather than as a systematic analysis of intellectual life, Benda does in fact cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considers real intellectuals.
Okay. One more time. It's not okay, but I don't have any words to say.
The other extreme, there's Julien Benda, an early 20th century French man of letters. His celebrated definition of intellectuals is that they are a tiny band of super gifted and morally endowed philosopher kings who constitute the conscience of mankind. While it's true that Benda's treatise, La Trahison des Clercs, the betrayal of the
La Trahison des Clercs,
intellectuals, has lived in posterity more as a blistering attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles, rather than as a
abandon their
systematic analysis of intellectual life, Benda does in fact cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considers real intellectuals.
This is my first impression of listening. There's less linking words or connected point. He leading like straight and not there's no changing pronounce. Okay, so let's reading slowly.
More or less to remain in place, doing the same kind of work year in and year out. Organic intellectuals are always on the move,
are always on
the make.
Always on the.
At the other extreme, there's Julien Benda, an early 20th century French man of letters. His celebrated
Like the
definition of intellectuals
intellectuals
is that
as a
they
team
are a tiny band of super gifted and
and
morally
morally
endowed
endowed
philosopher kings who
philosopher kings
constitute the conscience of mankind.
and mankind.
While it's
While it's
true that
true
Benda's
that
treatise, La
La
Trahison des
Trahison des
Clercs,
Clercs,
the betrayal
Prayer
of the
Lord
intellectuals,
has
lived in posterity
posterity
more
more
as a
as
blistering attack on intellectuals who
abandon
abandon their calling and compromise their
their
principles
compromise their mm, mm,
rather than as a systematic analysis of intellectual life. Benda does
intellectual life
in fact cite a small number of names and major
names and major characteristics
characteristics of those whom he
Whom
considers real intellectuals.
considers it um it's only text to be. He says something long words, something different words.
Socrates
Okay, let's read 0.8 feed.
more or less to remain in place, doing the same kind of work year in and year out. Organic intellectuals are always on the move, on the make. At the other extreme, there's Julien Benda.
At the at at the at the other extreme, other extreme, there is
an early 20th century French man of letters. His celebrated definition of intellectuals is that they are a tiny band of super gifted and morally endowed philosopher kings who constitute the conscience of mankind. While it's true that Benda's treatise, La Trahison des Clercs, the betrayal of the intellectuals, has lived in posterity more as a blistering attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles, rather than as a systematic analysis of
rather than as a systematic analysis.
Intellectual life, Benda does in fact cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considers real intellectuals. Socrates and Jesus.
Okay. A little shorter than always I shadowing, but yeah. Anyway, it's okay. I don't care. Okay, let's read.
Are frequently mentioned as on intellectual his celebrated markets. Unlike teachers and priests who seem more or less to remain in place, doing the same kind of work year in and year out, organic intellectuals are always on the move, on the make. At the other extreme, there's Julien Benda, an early 20th century French man of letters. His celebrated definition of intellectuals.
At the other extreme, there is Julian Bender. He is a 20th century 20th century's French letters. Celebrated definition. Okay, I forgot.
There's Julien Benda, an early 20th century French man of letters.
In early 20th century's French man.
His celebrated definition of intellectuals.
His celebrated definition of intellectuals
is that they are a tiny band.
Is that they're a tiny band. Is that they're tiny band of
super gifted.
Tiny band of
and morally endowed philosopher kings who
super gifted and morally endowed
a tiny band of super gifted and morally endowed philosopher
kings
who constitute the conscience of mankind. Kings who constitute the conscience of mankind.
Who constitute the conscience of mankind.
While it's true that Benda's treatise, La Trahison des Clercs, the betrayal of the intellectuals.
While it's true that Benda's treatise, La Trahison des Clercs, the betrayal of the intellectual,
has lived in posterity more as a blistering attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles, rather than
the betrayal of the intellectuals has lived in posterity more as a blistering attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles, rather than
as a systematic analysis of intellectual life.
Rather than as a systematic analysis of intellectual life.
Benda does in fact cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considers real intellectuals.
Benda does in fact cite cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considered to be rare intellectuals. Okay.
Of the intellectuals has lived in posterity more as a blistering attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles, rather than as a systematic analysis of intellectual life. Benda does in fact cite
a small number of names.
And major characteristics of those whom he considers real intellectuals.
Whom he considered to be real intellectuals.
Socrates.
Okay. Shadowing with 0.8 speed.
Intellectuals are
and audio muted. At the other extreme, there's Julien Benda, celebrated Frenchman matters. His celebrated definition of intellectuals is that they are one more. At the other extreme, there is Benda, and early 20th century celebrated definition of intellectuals is that they're tiny band of super gifted and morally endowed philosopher kings, who constitute the consciousness of mankind. While it is true that Bender's treatise, The Tison declares, the betrayal of the intellectual, has lived in posterity as a more bristling attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles rather than as a systematic analysis of intellectual life. He does in fact cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considered to be real intellectuals. .5 on the make. At the other extreme, there's Julian Bender, in the early 20th century French man of letters. His celebrated definition of intellectuals is that they are a tiny band of super-educated and morally endowed philosopher kings who constitute the conscience of mankind. Conscience for mankind. While it is true that the tide on the crest, the betrayal of the intellectuals, has lived in posterity as a bristling attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles rather than as a systematic analysis of intellectual life. It then does in fact cite small number of names and major characteristics of those whom considered to be real intellectuals. Okay, the last two times I lead and finish. Let's do this. At the other extreme, there is Julian Bender's celebrated definition of Julian Bender in the early 20th century Frenchman of letters. His celebrated definition of intellectuals as a tiny band of super gifted and morally endowed philosopher kings who constitute the conscious of mankind. Conscious. Conscience. Conscious. Why? Conscience. Okay. Philosopher kings who constitute the conscience of mankind. While it is true that Bender's treatise La Tison declares the betrayal of the intellectuals has lived in posterity more as a bristling attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles rather than as a systematic the conscience of mankind. What it is rather than as a systematic analysis of analysis rather than as a systematic why I forget systematic analysis of the intellectual life. He does in fact cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considered to be real intellectuals. Okay, last time. At the other extreme, there is Julian Bender's celebrated definition of intellectuals as a tiny band of super gifted and morally endowed philosopher kings who constitute the conscience who constitute the conscience of mankind. While it is true that Bender's treatise La Tison declares the betrayal of the intellectuals has lived in posterity more as a bristling attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles rather than as a systematic analysis of intellectual life. He does, in fact, cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considered to be real intellectuals. He does, in fact, cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considered to be real intellectuals. Okay. The last, no back. Do not get back the last time. At the other extreme, there is Julian Bender's celebrated definition of intellectuals as a tiny band of super gifted and morally endowed philosopher kings who constitute the conscience of mankind. While it is true that Bender's treatise La Tison declares the betrayal of the intellectuals has lived in posterity more as a bristling attack on intellectuals who abandon their calling and compromise their principles rather than as a systematic analysis of intellectual life. He does, in fact, cite a small number of names and major characteristics of those whom he considered to be real intellectuals. Okay, today's my lesson is finished. See you next time.